Market to Market is everywhere you are. Subscribe to Market on YouTube, find us on the PBS video app to stream on demand, and add our 3 podcasts on your favorite podcasting app.
Hi, it's Paul Yeager, and welcome to the MTOM Show podcast, which is a production of Iowa PBS and the Market to Market TV show. Glad to have you here. If you have any feedback for me, hit me up, paul.yeager@iowapbs.org, or the show in general, Market to Market, at iowapbs.org. And I'm kind of guessing we might get a little bit of feedback today because we are going to talk to the chief economist of the United States Department of Agriculture, Seth Meyer, past guest on Market to Market. We talked in November of 2020 in a show that looked at larger economic issues as we headed into Thanksgiving. Now, if you remember the end of 2020, which I know you do, things changed in August. We're going to talk about that and how things have changed in 2021 since he took his head job as the chief economist in January at the 3rd day of the year. He's in a non-political position. So how does he navigate an organization that is political because it's headed by a presidential appointee? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about his background in Iowa, on how he grew up on a farm, but not really. We'll let him explain that. How a guy who wanted to be an architect ended up as an economist, his time in Europe, working with WASDE. We'll talk about NASS reports because, you know, there was this big USDA report about acreage that came out last week. That's a big deal that we're going to talk into, but we're also going to dive into Twitter and how he reads it. It's a source, but does it influence policy? What does this old academic do with this new piece of technology? He's also talking about one of our market-to-market analysts, one of the regular ones, and what she says on Twitter. There's a hint, what she says on Twitter. That is this installment, a little longer than normal, but I really think you're going to stick around for this full discussion with Seth Meyer, chief economist at the USDA. Okay, Long Grove or Parkview or Eldridge, which one of those is the best of those of the North Scott communities? Or is McCausland in that too? Donahue? I mean, they're all great towns, but where were you from and which one, did you like the other towns?
Oh no, so absolutely. When I was and as we talked about, when I was a younger guy, my folks didn't have a farm. Had a farm background, always wanted to get back into doing that. My folks did. Lived in Eldridge for a while, in town in Eldridge for a while. I like Eldridge. I continue to like Eldridge. I like Long Grove. I like all those communities. You know, when I go to sub-cabinet at USDA, used to talk to folks about, remind them, hey, Iowa State Fair's coming up, or hey, you know, Denison is a stop on Ragbri this year. You know, I love that stuff. And it's always good to find the Iowans at USDA and remind them of all those festivals. It's great. I love all of them.
Well, which one had the Strawberry Festival?
That's Long Grove.
That's Long Grove.
That's Long Grove.
So
I haven't been to that in a long time.
I know, and I worked in Davenport for a number of years, and so I got to know all those areas, and I loved going around there. Scott County is one of the richest counties for farmland in Iowa, and so is Polk County for per acre, but it's not always necessarily because it's the greatest farmland. It's that whole development of acreage of Eldridge has expanded, or Davenport or Bettendorf or Polk County. So that's always a little misleading, but it's still pretty darn good farmland.
No, absolutely. And yeah, but you're right. There's always that encroachment where, you know, I mean, you think about Long Grove, you think about Eldridge kind of being that bedroom community into the Quad Cities as well, too. And everybody wants a few acres and moves out further. And so, no, at one point, I told you my folks got back into farming and they wanted to expand and find it really tough to justify expansion based purely on the price of the farmland, right? The cash flow of it makes it incredibly difficult.
So if they're not totally in when you're living there, why Iowa State then? I mean, was it agriculture in your mind?
No, I was going to be an architect. So that was...
That makes sense.
You know,
great architect.
I was going to be an architect or an engineer or an architect or something along those lines. So, I think we can all agree that college freshmen don't necessarily know what they really want to do. Took some classes in econ and ag econ and really loved it. decided I wanted to go to graduate school, and Dr. John Lawrence offered me a assistantship, right? And so for me, he used to let me put together the cattle and swine balance sheets for profitability every month. And here's one back in your memory. Bob Wisner was the other person who ran my assistantship as well too. So I got this what I call the very old school isn't the right word, but the really great Iowa extension livestock and crop economist experience. And I was hooked after that. That's what really hooked me.
So is that in your undergraduate time? And how early?
No, that was in my graduate time.
Okay, so then actually, how did your undergraduate then to get to that? Because you had to have had some type of hook to keep wanting to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of econ, and my degree is actually like in community planning, which is like zoning and city planning or rural planning and urban planning. But I took a lot of classes in econ, and that's what really fascinated me. And when I applied to graduate school, again, that opportunity came up from Dr. Lawrence. I'm like, this is great. I loved it. I really probably spent too much time thinking about that stuff. And they used to actually broadcast the market reports out of that same office suite. And I was always too scared to do it. They're always like, you can go do this if you want. And I'm like, I don't think I have that skill set. But they used to broadcast the market reports, the daily market reports from Iowa State out of that same office area.
So you would be fine putting the report together to hand to somebody to read, but you never wanted to read it?
Yeah, I always thought that was the more difficult part, right? Making it sound quick and easy and roll off the tongue. I always thought that was pretty tough, but so I never did it. But
that's the whole. There is a mundane lower range that some markets are given. They're very, corn up 42, this up da 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 da. You didn't have to be, hey, and it did this and it did that. You weren't the sports guy. Yeah,
but there are people out there for which that's interesting and important information, right? It's like, I don't want to mess this up. They always offered to let me do it. I just never, I was always too scared at that point. Now I'd love to go back and do it for a day.
So then, so you did master's. Did you apply anywhere else other than Iowa State?
I applied a few other folks around the Midwest, but Iowa State, I was at Iowa State, and this opportunity to work with those extension folks was great. So I was like, Iowa State is where I wanted to go. So,
and that's the breadbasket of the corn, right in the middle of the Corn Belt. So do you consider corn and soybeans, and you talked about livestock, are those what your foundation is built on?
Yeah, so it's funny. I will often, we're talking about trade. We talk about trade. We talk about this current high commodity price environment. And to me, really, corn, beans, and hogs are the things that are leading this all forward. And I always have to say, all things an Iowan could love, right? Corn, beans, and hogs, because I let folks know maybe I'm a little bit Iowa-centric in my commodity views and understanding. If you push me on things like specialty crops, I'm probably a little bit weaker. But no, absolutely, that's kind of foundationally corn, beans, hogs, and to a lesser extent cattle. I tend to focus on those things, but I admit it right up front.
Yeah, so. But you end up at Mizzou, which is almost the same type of setup in the sense of corn, beans, livestock. You just are getting a little closer to the wheat belt.
Yeah, and a little bit more cow-calf operation emphasis and some of these things. So part of what Mizzou's attractiveness was, there's a group there called the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute, right? And so from that standpoint, folks with a really great insight into terms of ag policy and the things that influence how these pieces of legislation evolve. So to me, that was incredibly fascinating. They were willing to give me a shot and go down there. And so I worked, and they weren't going to give me corn and beans right away. So I worked on cotton, of all things, for quite a long time, right? No. You got to start out here in cotton before we let you do the things really, we got cotton in Missouri as well, too. But, they put me on corn, beans, and hogs. They kept me away from corn, beans, and hogs, and I did cotton for a while.
It's like my friend who works at ESPN. When he was interviewed, they were like, "So, what are your favorite sports?" Well, the NFL. My favorite team's the Vikings. I like baseball. I'm like, okay, tell me about hockey. All right, or tell me about women's basketball. They went to that to help build your knowledge base. So, at what point did you realize academic was fine, but you had other aspirations of maybe government work?
So I think the University of Missouri and FAPRI is an incredibly unique place, which is it really straddles this. Yeah, I think when you go purely academic, you like to think they classify you in your impact factor as the number of times somebody cites a journal article. Okay, that's one view of impact, right? Having somebody on the Hill call you about trying to understand, hey, we're trying to put this piece of legislation together. Tell me where you think these price ranges should be. Tell me what the impacts are. Tell me how you think that this works. That's another kind of impact. And that kind of impact really attracts me as well, too. I like to talk about these things. I can write about them, but I like to talk about them even more and try to really think through them. I should probably be better at writing them all down, which is what an academic really should do. But that's where the attraction came. And I think University of Missouri was a really unique opportunity to do that. They have really great connections to policymakers. And actually been there quite a long time. So, I got my PhD there. I stayed there. I joined the faculty. I taught classes on statistics and price discovery and these types of things. And at some point I thought, well, this is great, but I better broaden myself. And an opportunity came along to go to FAO in Rome and do some longer term, big picture type of work. This quote, and I think people use this quote incorrectly mostly, and they use it incorrectly often, which is, we need to increase production by 60% by 2050, right? I'm sure you've heard that quote.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
That's the group I went into at FAO.
So not everybody's familiar with FAO, so you have to explain them.
Okay. So the Food and Ag Organization of the United Nations. So this offshoot of the United Nations, which really looks at food and agriculture. And then the group that I was in was much more of at FAPRI, it's this year and 10 years out, because that's kind of the government budget window, right? But this is more, hey, think big. Where are the water constraints? Where are the yield constraints? Where's population growth? So it was a much different activity for me to think out, no, we're going to think about 3 or 4 decades out, okay? But you and I all know that you can think out 3 or 4 decades, but it's always the immediate term that always seems to, you got to deal with today often. So I was there during the big 2012 drought. So somebody figured out that I both knew about U.S. agriculture and knew about biofuel policy and some of these things, and I ended up spending a lot of time on that. So in helping those folks kind of understand markets and that 10-year baseline. I was right there during the drought.
But they didn't quite put together the Iowa connection. I mean, Norman Borlaug has kind of been a name, in the world sense of agriculture. They'll say, oh, well, how far did you know Norman Borlaug? Because you lived in Iowa. I mean, did you get that when you were there?
No. So I don't think everybody made the connection, but I'll go back to 2012 and the director of FAO at the time made a comment about biofuel policy at the height of the drought. And I just wrote back to some of his folks and I'm like, well, that's not really the way it works. And all of a sudden everybody goes, oh, okay, this person knows something about drought. And I had my door at FAO, and every week, every few days, I'd put up the latest price for corn as the price of corn continued to rise. And that's not something everybody there follows, right? They have a lot of commodity expertise, but they have a lot of other folks involved in a lot of other aspects of food and agriculture. So as soon as somebody said, oh, this person knows both U.S. policy and kind of what's going on in terms of markets and prices, I ended up being pulled away to do some of that work as well.
So at what point then do you start working on the WASDE reports?
So I spent a couple of years at FAO, and FAO is kind of an interesting place. A lot of very sharp people there. always was interesting to go to meetings. Went to a meeting one time with and I guess you got to understand people a little bit. A meeting hosted by the French, and I went with a Prairie Canadian, so a non-French Canadian, and I went to a meeting, and it was just kind of very surprising to me, this difference in views of consolidation or farm work or staying on the farm, or quite honestly, you and I talked about this, how difficult farm work is, right? Farm work is very difficult. So, to me, it's, let's make sure folks can make a living if we're going to try and encourage them to stay on the, anyway, so there's this very different process. So I found FAO very revealing in terms of viewing how other people see developing world agriculture, how I see developing world agriculture, and how I see agriculture here in the United States. So at some point, I was at a meeting in Brussels, not even in the United States, and Joe Glauber was there. So Joe Glauber was the chief economist at the time. We had lots of conversations about different policies, and then he called me up and told me he had a job open for his senior domestic policy analyst back in Washington, D.C. And I don't think that's something you can pass up, right? When the chief economist asks you to apply for a job in DC to be involved in policy, something you love, I don't think you can pass it up.
And that connection's made, so you hang out at USDA for how long?
So I was at USDA for all of a year as the senior policy analyst, and Joe used to come down. I was next to the coffee machine. So two things. First thing in the morning would be Joe's schedule would come out and all the interesting folks to come in and talk to Joe. And then next, Joe would come down and get a cup of coffee. So he'd come down and get his cup of coffee, and he'd sit there and he'd say, well, what's interesting today? We'd talk about the markets. We'd talk about what's going on in the ag economy, bits and pieces. Oh, I'm looking at this. I'm looking at that. And then I'd whip out his schedule for the day, and I'd say, hey, can I come to this meeting? Can I come to this meeting? Hey, you're meeting with the railroad guys to talk about grain transport. Can I come? So really built a conversation every day with Joe about markets. And Jerry Bangy had been running the World Board, which is the group that puts out the WASDE report each month, kind of that very market sensitive report. He'd been doing it for more than 20 years and was going to retire. And Joe said, would you go over and run this group when Jerry retires, and then we'll find somebody to run it permanently. And so after a year, I went and ran the World Board. So I went from, FAPRI 10 years at a time to FAO to 3 decades. And now I'm down to 18 months over running the board. But loved it, absolutely loved working at the board. After a year, I had applied for the job, so I became the permanent head of the board. And so I spent the next 5 years there running the board.
What are the greatest challenges of putting reports out from that position? So
I think the greatest challenge is pulling in all these bits and pieces of information. So, when we think about the U.S., we really do, we have NAS, and NAS is unique among statistical agencies around the world. They really are unique around, the level of detail, I know folks like to poke and jab at them, but there's not anything else like that around the world in terms of agricultural statistics. So you have that, but you have to pull in all these other details at the board. You have to pull in satellite imagery. You pull in detailed weather information. You have reports from the embassies. USDA has folks around the world in key agricultural markets that send reports back. So you've got to synthesize all this stuff into a report. And then you explaining it to people is also another element. I don't think that that's necessarily what I want to say the difficulty is, but synthesizing all this information and bringing all this expertise across USDA. The group I ran was only 25 people, right? But we drew resources from all these other huge agencies, the Foreign Ag Service, Economic Research Service, bring all these folks together, sit them in a room, go over all these intense details. I had 5 meteorologists who worked for me, bring them over, tell us what you think's going on, what do you see, and synthesizing that. That's, to me, a challenge, but an awesome challenge. I'm one of these people that loves to talk about what does the wheat crop in the Ukraine look like. I could go, I love those kinds of conversations.
So we could do 30 minutes on Ukraine wheat, then, is what you're telling me right now.
We absolutely could. We could do 2 hours on Brazil corn if you wanted to. I love it.
So why does Ukraine wheat, Brazil corn, Brazil beans, Argentinian beans matter to the U.S. farmer in Scott County, Iowa, or Clinton County, Iowa, or DuPage County, Illinois?
No, absolutely. The WASDE is a public good, right? So the whole purpose of this is to once a month kind of put us all on an equal footing in terms of market understanding. We're a net exporter of agricultural goods. So clearly, look at the corn market today. You saw a run up in corn prices in the U.S. as questions started to rise about the size of the Brazilian crop, right? And then as we adjust to Chinese demand, that's the other element of this where we see big runs on corn, soybeans, and hogs. So clearly, I'd like to say, hey, this is a global public good, and it is. But we do this because it helps the U.S. folks market their grains effectively overseas. And if you go back in history, it's to try and limit the ability of some other countries to make moves into our market without everyone knowing what's going on. I mean, the origin of this report goes all the way back to the Soviet Union buying up a bunch of wheat, right? So let's try and make that transparent so producers are not, at least once a month, are not at a disadvantage in what the market information is.
You're referring to the Great Grain Robbery, and it's been mentioned quite a lot here in recent times that maybe that's what the Chinese are doing right now. Is it?
So another aspect of my job is to work in groups like there's a G20 initiative called the Ag Market Information System. And one of the constant things that I'll say is we've got a big player here that is clearly influencing global commodity prices, for which we have very limited information. I got to tell you a story. I went, the FAO invited me to a stocks meeting in China, a meeting on grain stocks in China. I got 30 minutes. I get up and I talk about, okay, here's how we survey grain stocks. Here's how we survey production. We have to back into livestock feed use and residual because it's harder to survey. So we survey the things we know. And so here's how we get to stocks. Then my Chinese colleague gets up and says, she's got 30 minutes as well too. Chinese grain stocks are a state secret. I cannot tell you what Chinese grain stocks are. Thank you. That was her 30-minute presentation, right? And so I'm almost confident we don't know what Chinese grain stocks are, right? So we try to make our best guess, put a level, talk about what the dynamics are. It's not transparent to the marketplace. Even if you look at things like corn and soybeans, the soybean market in China is much more transparent than is the corn market. And you can see this just by compare the price of a soybean on a ship outside of China to the price of a soybean inside China, and do the same for corn, and you can see they control those two markets very differently. So I think it's a real challenge here. It's one of those things where we spend a lot of time try to put these puzzle pieces together.
The last time we talked was in November. Phase 1 was really starting to ramp up, and it's only continued until recently the buying has stopped. Was the Chinese buying because of phase 1? Was it a need for the country to feed hogs and people? Combination, given what information that you're saying is hard to get out of the Chinese and their intentions.
Yeah, so my own thoughts is that the Chinese tend to buy what the Chinese think they need, right? If they can kind of signal this to phase 1, that's helpful as well too. But I tend to think that the Chinese buy what the Chinese need, right? And I think that the reason buying slows now is prices are very high. Let's pivot to other markets. Let's see how we continue to fill this in. But if you look at what our new estimates are for the coming crop year, they're consistent with need that reflects kind of what we've observed in the last year, right? In terms of corn exports and some of those other things. So I think that is one of the constant questions. It appears like a structural shift here where maybe this is, this next year is also a need need-based. We don't have great insights when it comes to things like stocks. We have seen the Chinese internal corn prices be about this high in the past, and it didn't have anything to do with an internal structural shortage. What it had to do with is trying to keep a very tight control on internal Chinese corn prices. And that's back in 2015 when we saw them take in things like DDGs and sorghum and barley. And to me, and so you're trying to read between the lines here. It seems like a structural issue, but they're also much more focused on corn this time. Right? They're fighting with the Australians about other political issues, so they're not taking their barley. They still have duties on our DDGs, so they're not taking much of that. They're taking our sorghum and focusing a lot on corn. But there are other aspects of this that feel different, like the rebound in the swine herd from ASF. But there's yet another question, right?
Right. That's always another question of, so I guess to tie this to WASDE and to tie it to NASS, the reliability of information, I would imagine, is critical to be able to put together as good of a picture. Now, if I read Ag Twitter correctly, USDA doesn't know what they're doing about their surveys out in the land. That's the Americans' answer. I can't imagine how you have to look skeptically at information you get from other places, right? Isn't that part of the job, is to be skeptical of the information and the sources?
Oh, so absolutely. So first, going back to your first point is, I invite everybody to lockup. No one ever leaves lockup thinking we don't know what we're doing. That's the one great thing about lockup. So I think that's a good aspect of this. And actually, to your other point about being skeptical about information from other countries, we don't feel compelled to use any other country's official information. You know, and oftentimes this information exhibits a pattern, or we may have concerns about it. One of the challenges overseas has been, I got invited to India, and my peer in India, I was explaining what we do, and there was an audience, and my peer in India was agitated because the crowd relied more on USDA estimates of India than they did on India's own government information, right? Because they saw us as being impartial and timely and trying to get at a good number without any political interference. And that's absolutely true.
Well, I just heard it was discussed before we recorded a Market to Market just a couple of weeks ago about the India you think China is bad at information, India is worse. I'm not going to make you answer that one, but they are challenging.
Yeah, and I will give a little bit in countries where producers are a little more disaggregated and smaller scale, lots and lots of smaller scale, that maybe these things are harder to operationalize. But I think in some cases it's just a lack of transparency. Right? Some information, even uncertain, is probably better than no information at all.
Go back to lockup for me. Are you still in on some of those?
So I'm now absolutely, but I'm now on the other side. Instead of having to be in lockup and then present, that's Dr. Jekanowski now, I'm on the other side of this, which is I'm often now the secretary designate. So I'm the one designated to sign a lot of the reports. So now I get to stroll in and listen and ask the questions. I do miss the buzz of kind of being in there and the process of putting the report together. But again, I'll go back to, I'm not a political. The head of the World Board is not a political. But I don't even like to talk to him about what they're going to do in the report for the week coming up. I don't want him to think that I've got an opinion that should maybe influence what he does. So we don't talk about it. We may talk around the edges of it. But then I get to go in lockup and seeing it all fresh and just as it's rolling out.
You took the job January 1 or January 20?
3rd.
January 3rd. So
3rd. Yep.
That's in the previous administration. You would have interviewed and been hired under the other administration. So your position, as you said, not political. How does that create challenges of whoever is in charge of USDA with you trying to be independent of the agency and balance what a specific administration is trying to say, do, or influence?
So I think you've hit on the challenges as we change we always change administrations. I think eventually everyone so our job's advisory, right? Here's the economic facts. Here's the way the market works. And we're there to offer our insights to the secretary. And that's what we do. And I think you and I can both agree that everything eventually comes down to markets and economics to some point when it comes to the commercial ag aspects of the U.S. So, they eventually come around saying, hey, here are our priorities, but we need to understand this, because if folks are focused on where corn prices are at, where commodity prices are at, we need that information, because that's going to be the lens that a lot of folks will view this from. So I think it's always, folks in the administration on the political side have their policies, but they come to you to get really solid market information, dynamics. How is this policy going to influence this? Is this policy, hey, we would like to do this. What are the implications of doing it? And that's, for me, great fun. That's the part I love doing that.
But Seth, USDA has a heavy thumb on the markets. I keep hearing that. That's not true?
No, it's absolutely not true, right? So again, I'll go back to, I don't even talk to Dr. Jekanowski about what he's going to do in the WASDE much, even in private conversations, because I don't want them to think, hey, the chief economist thinks we should be exporting more or less. I don't even want that influence to even be perceived. And I've never experienced any political interference from anybody in terms of those numbers. I'd occasionally get jabbed by undersecretaries the same way the public jabs. So, hey, don't you think that's too low? I'm like, well, we'll wait. You just wait. We'll wait and see. But I think that it was all good nature. They knew me well enough that was all understood. I never felt any political, and never have felt any political pressure to change those things.
All right, so not political pressure, but let's talk Twitter pressure. Recently, I had Angie Setzer on the show, and she made a comment. She kind of stuck her neck out about, this was in May, something's going to happen in June. And I think you picked up on it and said, what do you know about June 15th? How do you rate information that comes in from people whose lives it is to weigh balance sheets outside of you, but through A, their clients, B, how they can help their clients or help their organization? They do figuring with surveys as well. Is that just as strong of an influence as maybe someone else?
Yeah. So first of all, the goddess of grain, I'm a Twitter follower of hers. No, I love her. I mean, kind of snarky comments about the market. I appreciate that views. I see lots of other people put out information, including some academics. And the only thing that bothers me about Twitter is I really do feel constrained incredibly on my ability to respond, because you really do. I mean, there's some gems in there from time to time, right? You can pull them out of there and find bits and pieces of information. And I will tell you, there's almost no faster flow of information than Twitter to some extent, right? Some ship in Brazil knocks down a boom or disrupts port traffic. You know about her on Twitter instantly, right? But there's also a lot of people talking their book on Twitter as well, too, as we call it. So you got to understand that, and then you can pull out the little grains or the little nuggets of things that you think are interesting that you want to explore more. I read it. I really wish I could respond more, quite honestly. I wish I could say, hey, that's not right. This is how it works. And I do sometimes, but I'm very selective in saying, if I can make a clear case that doesn't suggest to anybody I'm suggesting this is where USDA is moving, then I'll do it. That's my concern, right?
Right. So did you respond more when you were back at FAPRI and at the zoo? Yeah. So you've had to kind of dial it back, and that's your own choice, or did somebody up above?
No, it's mostly my own choice, right? Nobody's come and said, don't do this, but I'm conscious of, I don't think I have great influence, but I might have a little bit of influence in the way people view things, and I'm cautious about that. We didn't get back to this, but I left USDA after I ran the World Board, right. And I went back to academia, right? So I went back and I said, okay, I'm going to go back to the university, and I went back to FAPRI again to do more ag policy work. So pure short-term markets went and did back to ag policy. And I had spent such time in the prior administration being the subject matter expert on biofuel policy that I spent a lot of time on Twitter saying, that's not exactly how it works. That's not exactly how it works. This is the detail that matters. I'm much more cautious now because folks have the impression that I either know or are revealing something that may not be true. And plus I'm cautious, I may be revealing something I don't mean to reveal. So I feel like I have to dial it back a little bit. I see stuff weekly on how USDA works or biofuel policy or ag policy that I'd like to intervene on, but I better not.
Isn't there one thing you'd want to sound off on right now?
Is there one thing I want to sound off on? I think you and I have talked about it in general. I mean, if people like to throw USDA under the bus when the market moves against them. I do have to tell you a story that when I took the job at the World Board, I had an assistant, a guy, and my phone number was published it's published right in the WASDE report. And he was surprised because when I started working there, I'd take the phone calls that come in. He was surprised that there'd be, hey, some guy's on the phone and he's complaining about you lost him money in the grain markets today. I'm like, okay, send it over. And he was really surprised by this. I'd answer my own phone calls the day after WASDE. So I kind of miss that. I kind of miss being, to some extent, being able to I'm very cautious and try to make the very strong case of here's how this actually works. But that's hard to do on Twitter. Twitter's a 20-word smack talk is basically what it is. It's hard to put strong content in there.
Well, only from your academic standpoint, where academics are not always known for being brief, you explain things in a larger context. Twitter is not quite the avenue always. Because I look at Scott Irwin at the University of Illinois, and he will number his tweet points. Like he'll be on yesterday on the report. Here's number 1, 2, 3, and I'll see 8 or 6, or 12. Yeah. Like he has all of those points. That's not always something you can do.
No, and it's hard to do, and it's funny because, and I probably shouldn't judge when I see academics tweet. I probably judge, being a former academic, probably go, I want to go into a 9-tweet response on all the finer details, but you can't. Twitter's not the place for that, and so you really do have to kind of pull the nuggets out of there. But I do love following the goddess of grain, just as a general principle.
I'll make sure she hears that.
All right.
We are talking the day after a large report, a highly anticipated report by USDA. Oddly, going back to what you just said, I didn't see USDA get too beat up about it. Markets responded positive, but somebody didn't like it. Those who need to buy the grain didn't like that price. So when you look at that report that just happened, is it as significant as it was made out to be?
I think it was a significant report. Now, I'm not surprised at the direction of the market response. I am kind of surprised we had big moves yesterday. And I know it's in part of this is because we're at a sensitive, markets are tight. We're at a sensitive part of the market. We're kind of in terms of stock holding. I think it's also, we're kicking the can farther down the road. So now we're kind of getting a better picture of what maybe we are dealing with and where's the next opportunity for response. I mean, the weather is the weather, and so you can't respond to that necessarily. So now we're pushing kicking the can down the road to the South American crops now. So, I was a little bit surprised by perhaps the size of the response, but not the direction of the response. Some things in there, when you look at principal crop area, you kind of look at USDA's behavior, NASA's behavior between what farmers say they're going to plant and what they plant. You kind of look between that. And that's really what I was looking towards. There isn't often a time where you see a big increase from intentions to planting in those reports. You do sometimes see a decrease, but that's weather related, but you don't often see an increase. So when I look at the market surprise, I struggle with a few things, which is, did folks expect a big increase in overall principal crop area? Did they expect corn and soybeans to take more area from other crops? Or did they expect the total to increase, or did they expect corn and soybeans to take more away from other crops? And we weren't at a record combined corn and soybean area, but we were pretty darn close. So part of me struggles with where did the market anticipate these crops coming from? What was the original thought? Were you going to get record corn and soybean area and take it from what? Is it no NASS was going to raise principal crop area, which seems like a stretch to me? And then to me, it raises one big question, which is, where's that land? Where is that land when we think about principal crop area planted this year versus, say, 15, 16, 17, 18? I don't want to talk about 19 and 20 because of prevent plant, but 15, 16, 17, 18, we're not even quite back up to those levels. And we're still, maybe 8 million acres below where we were from 10 to 14. Maybe it takes a while for producers to respond to these very high prices. So I'm quite curious where we end up in terms of total aggregate area, and where is that land? It's not CRP, because CRP is actually a little bit lower than when we were at 2015.
So have we hit peak acres in the United States for cropland?
I don't think we've lost 10 million acres of farmland in the last few years. I don't know. And that's what I struggle with here. And that's the price signals, we started to run on commodity prices basically from August 20. And I think if you went back into your archives and you kind of think about producers' mentality pre-August 2020 and post-August 2020, they're almost night and day, right? So we've basically had a steady increases in prices for things an Iowan could love, corn and soybeans, from August 20 all the way through May, through mid to early May. And so I do wonder, where that area is. Now, I can pick out some states for you. I can pick out some states for you where I say we have a lot of drought in the West. We have a lot of dry conditions in the West. You can point, when you think about principal crop area, are there areas where folks have pulled back on planting simply because they don't have the water to do so? But I guess my surprise was maybe back in March, not as much given that total planted, the principal crop area. But maybe we also have a lag for producers to come back in and have confidence. Hey, this is what, I'll do these things that I need to do in order to bring these lands in production.
You mentioned 2012 as a year. Is 2012 and 2021 matching, lining up similarly?
Oh, so I think what I have to distinguish here is we have a lot of very serious drought conditions in the West, right? Like historic drought conditions where folks, this is the worst drought where you actually have records. We have incredible drought conditions out there. I know we have some dryness in the U.S. in some places. We were talking about Iowa, maybe Northwest Iowa, not getting the rain that Southeast Iowa has been getting. And certainly here in Missouri, we're getting plenty of rain. So I don't think comparisons to 2012 in terms of some of the crops that we talk about in Iowa, I don't think that comparison is there yet. But I do have concerns about dryness we observe in North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Northwest Iowa, and we're clearly keeping an eye on that.
Yeah, the Drought Monitor came out right before we recorded, and it was actually the lowest it's been in at least 20 weeks in the terms of numbers of areas. But it's where that acreage came out, because if you look at the midsection, let's go Kansas south, then to the east, there's a whole lot of moisture. In fact, I just saw a picture out of Ohio this morning, pretty wet. I saw a kayak in a bean field in central Kansas. There's a lot of moisture in a lot of places. Now, Illinois could have an incredible year. Indiana could have an incredible year. We're still pretty darn good without all those acres of producing corn and soybeans, even in dry or wet times.
Yeah, and I think you go back to 2012. My on the extreme eastern end still had a pretty good corn yield. They did because they were fortunate enough to get this. So I think comparisons to 2012, it's way too early for that, and it looks very different. Not to minimize the fact that folks who are going to see effects, those are really important to them, but I don't think we're there in an aggregate sense. But we're also in a pretty tight market already, so that's why I think we see these big responses in the market, as we saw with the release of the report yesterday, right? In the grand scheme of things, what's this many hundreds of thousands of acres different between market expectations and where NASS came out? But we're also at the time where those bushels actually mean a lot more. So I think that's why we see such big market moves in a report release like that.
All right, real quick, I got two questions. One is I want to dive right back there to what you just said. Before those people go into lockup to do the final report, are they looking at those private estimates and where the range is as a data point to help their discussion?
So, in terms of NASS, I think they avoid looking at those, right? And I know at the board, we, especially since largely we take, we always discuss them. There's a guy, just as a story, there's a guy that runs a wheat forecast in the Black Sea called Sovicon. And his dad used to help him, and his dad worked on a collective farm, and they have this long history. Of course, we read their reports. We read and see where they're at, but we don't feel constrained by those, right? We have, in lots of locations, we have folks on the ground. Again, I've got 5 meteorologists. We have a meeting every month on the Black Sea just to focus on Black Sea wheat. One of the folks that's a Drought Monitor author works in my shop as well, too, Brad Rippey, who you probably
we've used Brad lots of times. Yeah,
and Brad's great. So do we look at what folks have to say and some of their views? Absolutely. But we never feel constrained like, okay, we got to be right in there with the pack. Maybe we'd get less complaints if we did, but we don't feel constrained, right? So that ought to be evidence we don't feel constrained by that, right?
Right. All right. Last question. I appreciate all this time here. If I'm a producer in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, South Dakota, North Dakota, wherever I'm at, what are the 3 biggest storylines I'm watching here for the rest of this year from an economist standpoint? What are the ones that will impact me the most?
Okay. Some things that nobody can do anything about, like weather. Obviously, that's one of the big elements here, right? And I don't mean just our own weather. I'll say our own weather. Obviously, that's the biggest short-term effect. Chinese demand. How does China follow through on this? Watching what those export demand are. I think one of the big stories here is China's taken a whole bunch of the crops that an Iowan produce and livestock like hogs. I think the other element of that is other demand, export demand hasn't backed off. So that's a good story. So watch that. Second, ASF in China. If we had another outbreak, that might be very negative for your producers in Iowa, both from a corn and soybean export. We'll take off what's been pretty insensitive to the price demand. The Chinese seem to be buying it no matter what the price is. Is that 2? Does that get me
That's
to 2?
You need one more.
And then the third one, I think the third one I'm going to say is something that I think folks overestimate its importance in the short run. And that I'll say is biofuel policy, exactly where the EPA ends up here on some of this pending legislation. Do I think biofuel policy is important for Iowa grain producers? Absolutely, I do. Okay. I think in the short run, some of these actions, folks tend to take the short run actions as being more important to the market than long-term stability. And I don't know that we've had long-term stability for quite a while, right? So I think that folks absolutely need to take an interest in the short run, because those policy levers are important for the long run. It's not necessarily the bump you get this year. It's kind of that long run demand picture.
Seth Meyer, thank you so very much for your time. I appreciate it. My thanks to Seth Meyer, Chief Economist at USDA, for his time. Feedback, market to market at iowapbs.org. Thank you so very much for watching, listening, or reading. We always appreciate each and every time you make it to this part of the program. Thank you, and we'll talk to you next time.